In the monsoon of 1974, the trenches of Quezon Camp weren't made of dirt. They were made of liquid mud and fear. Mateo, a boy from the Visayas who spoke only broken Tagalog, found himself pressed shoulder to shoulder with Antonio, an Ilocano with a gaze as sharp as a bayonet. They couldn't understand each other's mother tongues, but they understood the sound of mortar fire. Every night, as the jungle breathed its heavy, humid air, they shared a single, thin military blanket. It was the only warmth in a world that felt cold and indifferent. Without a word, Mateo would hand Antonio half his rations, and Antonio would sharpen Mateo's knife. They weren't just soldiers, they were two halves of the same soul, surviving on a language of gestures and shared silence. Their luck ran out during a midnight patrol. The jungle turned into a trap of gunfire and screaming. Mateo and Antonio were cut off, cornered in a ravine, and tied up with rough vines that dug into their wrists. They spent 2 days in a cramped hole, shivering from the damp earth and the lack of food. Communication was impossible, but when Antonio found a sharp rock in the dirt, he didn't need words. He spent hours sawing at Mateo's bindings until his own fingers were raw and bleeding. When the ropes finally snapped, they didn't wait for a plan. They scrambled up the muddy slope and ran through the thick brush, their lungs burning and thorns tearing at their uniforms. They were exhausted and starving, but they kept moving because the only thing worse than the insurgency was the thought of being left behind alone.
Bilis!
Antonio hissed, pulling Mateo forward. Rescue came as a roar of engines and shouting voices, but it wasn't the reunion they imagined. 2 different military units had converged on the extraction point. In the frantic rush to evacuate, the officers were screaming orders, throwing men onto the back of moving trucks. Mateo was shoved into the first vehicle. Antonio was pulled toward the second. There was no time for addresses, no time for a map, and no common language to scream their promises. As the trucks pulled away in opposite directions, the red dust of the Quezon roads rose between them like a curtain. Mateo leaned over the tailgate, reaching out into the empty air, watching Antonio's face disappear into the haze. He didn't know then that the silence of the jungle was about to last for 25 years. Manila, 1999. The city was a different world, full of glass, neon, and the smell of roasting coffee. Mateo was no longer a scared boy in a trench. He was a man with a slight limp, a graying temple, and a family that loved him. He was walking through a crowded mall, his wife's laughter and the chatter of his children filling the air. He was content. He was safe. But then, he stopped. The world around him seemed to decelerate, the noise of the shoppers fading into a dull hum. The standing near the fountain was a man in a crisp baron, his posture still as rigid and disciplined as a soldier on guard. The man turned, and for the first time in 2 decades, the red dust finally settled. Mateo's breath caught in his throat. It was the eyes. The same eyes that had watched over him under a thin blanket in 1974. Across the polished floor of the mall, Antonio froze. The tactical instructor, known for his nerves of steel, felt his knees go weak. He didn't see the local official or the family man. He saw the boy who had shared his rations in the mud. Tears began to glaze his eyes, reflecting the bright mall lights like stars. Neither moved. The weight of 25 years of unsaid words and missing pieces hung in the air between them. Mateo's wife touched his arm, asking if he was okay, but he couldn't answer. He was back in the jungle. The moon and Rogo would be anything that presented him in the state of the left. He was back in the silence. Various silences. In that moment, the 25th hour began. A time that belonged to no one else but them. Antonio took a single, shaky step forward, his lips trembling with a name he hadn't spoken since the dust rose in Quezon. After the shock at the mall, the silence between them was broken by a single pager message. Antonio wasn't just in Manila for a visit. he had been reassigned to the city to oversee the estate of his dying uncle, a wealthy but lonely man with no other heirs. Between hospital visits and legal meetings, Antonio found himself with hours of empty time. He used it to find Mateo. They began a ritual of meeting in the humid corners of Manila's business district. To their families, they were just two veterans discussing investments and associates. But as they sat over coffee, the talk of the past felt less like a memory and more like a haunting. They were looking for the boys they used to be, only to realize that the bond they forged in the mud had never actually aged. A month later, the uncle passed away, leaving Antonio with a massive, ancestral house in a quiet Quezon City suburb and a mountain of old furniture to clear. The burden was physical and emotional. Mateo offered to help, justifying it to his own wife as helping an old comrade with a heavy lift. Day after day, they hauled heavy Nara cabinets and boxed up a lifetime of memories. The work was grueling, but it gave them something they hadn't had in decades: total privacy. Inside those high stone walls, away from the prying eyes of their associates and the noise of the streets, the professional masks began to slip. Every brush of their shoulders as they carried a table, every shared bottle of water, felt like a dangerous spark in a room full of dry wood. They weren't just clearing a house, they were clearing the path to a truth they had both buried. On the final day, the house was nearly empty, echoing with every footstep. The sun was setting, casting long, golden bars across the dusty floor. Antonio stood in the middle of the living room, clutching the brass keys, his shoulders finally sagging under the weight of his grief and his secrets. Mateo stepped closer, reaching out to pull him into a grounding hug, the kind of embrace two old soldiers share. But as Antonio leaned his head against Mateo's shoulder, the room went still. The hug didn't break. The seconds turned into a minute, and the air between them grew heavy and electric. Mateo felt Antonio's heart racing against his own, a rhythm he remembered from the trenches. When they finally pulled back just a few inches, they didn't let go of each other's arms. They stayed there, suspended in the space between being brothers and being something more, searching each other's eyes for permission. The silence in the room was broken by the sound of their breathing. There was no more talk of the past or the war. Antonio looked at Mateo, and the pretense of being just brothers finally snapped. It wasn't a slow movie moment, it was a desperate, heavy surrender. When they kissed, it felt like the release of 25 years of held breath. It was rough and unpracticed, tasting of the humid Manila heat and the salt on their skin. Mateo's hands gripped Antonio's face, his fingers rough against his jaw, finally acknowledging the one thing they had both been running from since 1974. For those few seconds, the families, the reputations, and the laws they lived by didn't matter. They weren't soldiers or fathers, they were just two men who had waited too long to be truthful. They stood in the center of the dark living room, unable to meet each other's eyes. The air was thick with the realization that they could never go back to being just friends. "I have to go back to the hotel," Antonio whispered, his voice trembling as he fumbled for his keys. Mateo only nodded, his heart hammering against his ribs. He watched Antonio walk toward the door, his rigid military posture momentarily shattered. They both had families to return to and roles to play, but the seal had been broken. As Mateo drove home through the neon-lit streets, he looked at his reflection in the rearview mirror. He was a respectable man with a life built on duty, but he was now carrying a secret that could destroy everything he worked for. The 25th hour had arrived, and there was no turning back the clock. Guilt is a heavy rucksack, and after the night in the empty house, it was becoming impossible to carry. To escape the prying eyes of their wives and the suffocating routine of their Manila lives, they organized a veterans hiking trip. It was the perfect excuse. two old soldiers going back to the mountains to honor their fallen comrades. Their families packed them extra water and warm jackets, completely unaware that this wasn't a pilgrimage of duty, but a desperate search for freedom. As they reached the trailhead, far away from the city's judgment, the tension finally broke. For the first time in 25 years, they didn't have to watch their backs. They walked side by side, their hands occasionally brushing, breathing in the thin, cold air of a mountain that didn't care about their secrets. For a few hours, they weren't husbands or officials. They were just Mateo and Antonio, finally alone. But the mountains in the Philippines are never truly predictable. By mid-afternoon, the sky turned a bruised purple, and the wind began to howl through the ridges. A sudden tropical storm slammed into the peak, turning the dry trail into a river of sludge. They were scrambling for cover when the ground beneath them gave way. A massive mudslide roared down the slope with the sound of a freight train. Antonio tried to jump, but his foot caught in a tangle of roots. In a flash of red earth and falling timber, he was swept down the ravine. "Antonio!" Mateo screamed, his voice swallowed by the rain. He threw himself down the slippery bank, clawing at the mud until he found his friend, pinned under a fallen branch and clutching his shattered leg in silent agony. The war was over, but the jungle had come back to claim them. The descent was a slow, punishing struggle. With the trail washed out and the rain turning the world into a blur of gray, Mateo did the only thing he knew how to do. He hoisted Antonio onto his back. It wasn't a heroic sprint, it was a grueling, agonizing crawl. Mateo's knees buckled under the weight of a man his own size, his boots slipping on the slick clay with every step. Antonio's head rested heavily against Mateo's shoulder, his breathing ragged and uneven. There were no brave words or promises, just the sound of the rain and the wet thud of Mateo's footsteps. Every time Mateo felt like collapsing, he looked at Antonio's pale face and adjusted his grip. He didn't think about the decades they had lost. He only thought about the next 10 meters of mud. He carried him for hours, his muscles trembling and his mind blank, focused entirely on the weight of the only person who made his life feel real. By the time they reached the rural hospital at the base of the mountain, Mateo was unrecognizable, covered in blood, mud, and tears. He refused to leave Antonio's side until the doctors forced him out. Hours later, as the dawn broke, Antonio was stabilized in a cramped, quiet ward. Exhausted and broken, Mateo didn't go to the waiting room. He slumped into the small space at the foot of Antonio's narrow bed, his hand gripping Antonio's in a death grip. They fell into a deep, heavy sleep, their fingers still intertwined. They were still like that when the door swung open. Their wives had arrived together, driven by the same panic. They didn't see two best friends recovering from a hike. They saw two men holding on to each other, as if the rest of the world had ceased to exist. The silence in the hospital room was sharper than any knife. Antonio's wife stood in the doorway, her face pale as she stared at their joined hands. Mateo woke up first, seeing the look of dawning horror on her face. He didn't pull his hand away, not because he was brave, but because he simply couldn't let go yet. No words were exchanged, but the blood brotherhood lie had finally burned out. The way Mateo looked at her husband wasn't the look of a comrade, it was the look of a man who had found his soul. Antonio stirred, his eyes fluttering open to see his wife watching them with a cold, terrifying suspicion. The storm on the mountain had passed, but a much bigger one was just beginning. The 25th hour was over, and the morning light was bringing a truth that none of them were ready to face. The weeks following the hospital were a slow, suffocating death for their old lives. There were no shouting matches, only a cold, vibrating silence that filled their homes. Antonio's wife had made her decision. They were moving back to the province immediately. Antonio, crushed by the weight of his children's faces and the pressure of his family's expectations, finally gave in. He began packing the Nara furniture from the uncle's house, moving like a machine. He was preparing to disappear into a life of quiet regret, far away from the city and the man who had saved him. Matteo watched from a distance, unable to call. He felt the red dust of 1974 rising again, threatening to swallow the only person who made him feel alive. The airport was a sea of moving bodies and mechanical announcements. Antonio walked through the terminal like a man going to his own execution, his wife and children flanking him like guards. Every step toward the security line felt like a heavy stone being added to his burden. He checked his bags and moved toward the gate, his eyes scanning the crowd one last time for a familiar face, a sign, anything. But there was nothing but strangers. He felt a hollow ache in his chest, worse than any wound from the war. He had spent his whole life following orders, and now, he was following the ultimate one. The order to forget. He sat at the gate, clutching his boarding pass, the sound of the world fading into a dull hum. As the ground crew began preparing the tunnel for boarding, Antonio's wife took his hand, a gesture of possession more than affection. He stared at the tarmac through the massive glass windows, watching the plane that would take him away from his truth. As for a minute, the process of holding a belt, which is a suited that helps revenges described mean. As the pager was much more similar into this, and this one could. As the principal resource, he looked down, his heart hammering against his ribs. It wasn't a code this time. It was a text message that cut through 25 years of pretense. The war never ended for us. I'm at gate 4. Don't go back to the mud. Antonio's breath hitched. He looked up and saw him. The standing behind a heavy concrete pillar across the terminal was Matteo, waiting, silent, his eyes fixed on Antonio with the same steady gaze from the trenches. The intercom crackled, but the announcement felt miles away. Antonio's wife stood up, gathering their things, but Antonio remained seated. He watched the other passengers line up. A slow, steady stream of people moving toward a future he didn't want. He looked at his wife's back as she organized the kids, then looked back at gate 4. He had minutes, not seconds, but every tick of the clock felt like a physical blow. He thought about the house he had just cleared, the kiss in the dark, and the weight of Matteo on his back in the rain. He was a man who had always known his duty, but for the first time, he was weighing it against the cost of his own soul. The line at the gate was thinning, but Antonio stayed still, caught in the middle of two different lives. The final boarding call echoed through the hall, a sound that usually meant the end of the road. His wife turned back, her hand outstretched, her eyes searching his with a mix of fear and command. "Antonio, please," she whispered. Antonio stood up slowly, his boarding pass crinkling in his hand. He looked at the gate agent, who was already starting to close the heavy door, and then he looked across the terminal at Matteo. Matteo hadn't moved an inch. He was a fixed point in the chaos, a soldier waiting for his partner to make the final call. Antonio took a deep breath, the sterile airport air filling his lungs as he looked at the exit and then at the plane. The choice was right in front of him, and as he took his first step, the screen fades to black.